I still remember the way sunlight used to slide across the marble floor of our dining room, slow, deliberate, like it knew it wasn't supposed to touch anything. The house was always quiet in the mornings, except for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock and the smell of roasted coffee drifting from the kitchen. That smell meant she was there, my nanny. Her name doesn't matter now, not because she wasn't important, but because I've spent years trying to forget it, the way my father did so easily. She was warmth in a house that had none. She called me sweetheart, and no one else ever did. She smelled of detergent and jasmine lotion. When she brushed the crumbs off my face before school, her hands felt like forgiveness. People think growing up rich means being free. I learned it means being watched, by tutors, by staff, by silence itself. Our house wasn't built for children. It was built for appearances. My father used to say that real men don't need noise to prove they exist. He said it the way some people say prayers, with faith and fear. He didn't like her much. He thought affection made boys weak. I think he saw her kindness as something that threatened his version of discipline. The kind of discipline that came with polished shoes, perfect posture, and a voice that could freeze a room. That morning started like any other. I was 8, maybe 9. I remember it because my school uniform still felt stiff, like it was meant for someone else's life. The sky outside was grey, not dramatic, just the ordinary grey of rich neighborhoods, where even the weather seems tired of pretending. I came downstairs to find her setting the table. The silver gleamed like it knew its worth. She was humming something, a song from her hometown maybe. It wasn't loud, just enough to make the air feel alive. Then I heard the footsteps. My father's shoes always made a distinct sound on the floor, a slow, heavy rhythm that meant the day was about to begin, and someone would probably cry before it ended. He entered the room without a word. He never said good morning to anyone who wasn't useful. He sat at the head of the table, unfolded the newspaper, and began his silent inspection of the world. She placed his coffee in front of him, careful, almost ceremonial, and then she spilled it, just a drop, a single brown mark blooming against the white tablecloth, like a wound. Her hands froze. I saw her eyes widen, not from fear of the stain itself, but from what it meant. My father lowered the newspaper, slowly. That's how you knew something was about to break, not in noise, but in stillness. He looked at her, not with anger, with disappointment. That was worse. Disappointment from him was a kind of execution. There's a reason we hire help, he said softly, to make life easier, not messier. She apologized, once, twice. I remember the way her voice cracked on the third time. She tried to dab the coffee with a napkin, but her hands were trembling. The silver clinked, as if the house itself was flinching. I sat there, frozen, watching her shrink before my father's calm authority. He wasn't shouting. That was the terrifying part. His cruelty was always quiet, precise. He didn't need to raise his voice to destroy someone. He just had to remind them of their place. She whispered something about being sorry, about the cup being too hot. He didn't respond. He simply stood up, looked at her once more, and said, "Carelessness is a form of disrespect." Then he left the room. The door closed behind him like a verdict. I remember her standing there, staring at the stain, as if it had revealed something she'd always known, but never admitted. And then she turned away, shoulders trembling, trying not to cry in front of me. That hurt more than anything, watching an adult try to protect a child from their own humiliation. I didn't say anything. I just sat there, staring at the mark on the tablecloth, wondering how something so small could feel so enormous. That was the first time I understood what power really was. It wasn't money or status, or the number of people who said yes. It was the ability to make someone disappear without lifting a hand. My father's face that morning taught me more about cruelty than any punishment ever could. It was clean, composed, rational, as if emotion were a luxury he couldn't afford. And her face, her silence, taught me about survival, about how some people learn to disappear while still standing right in front of you. We're close to reaching 1,000 subscribers. Help me share these memories, not because they belong to me, but because they belong to anyone who's ever seen kindness crushed under the weight of pride. Tell me where you're watching from. I want to know how far these stories travel. Sometimes I still dream of that table, of the coffee stain that never really left the fabric. Maybe it's still there, under layers of polish and denial, a small reminder that perfection always hides a wound. When people ask what it's like to grow up rich, I think of that moment, the hush, the trembling, the way I learned that silence is just another way to scream. That was the day I stopped believing that love and power could exist in the same room. After that morning, something in the air of the house shifted. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me to feel it. It was as if the silence had grown heavier, thick enough to make you breathe slower. My father didn't mention what had happened. He never needed to. His power worked like gravity, invisible, absolute, impossible to escape. She stayed for a few more days after that. I could tell she was trying to hold on, moving quietly, doing everything twice as fast, twice as perfectly. Every cup, every shirt, every corner of the house seemed to carry her apology. I wanted to tell her it wasn't her fault, but I didn't. Children in houses like ours don't speak unless spoken. We were raised to confuse obedience with love. My father's days were carved into ritual. Breakfast at 8, meetings at 9, a nap after lunch that no one was allowed to disturb. Dinner precisely at 7, silence mandatory except for the sound of his cutlery. If someone dropped a fork, time itself seemed to stop. That week I started paying attention to the way people behaved around him. The gardeners bowed their heads. The driver never made eye contact. Even my mother, elegant, perfumed, perfect, seemed smaller when he entered the room. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile that asks for mercy. And yet, to the world, he was charming. He was the man who donated to hospital, who spoke softly to reporters, who tipped generously at restaurant. People called him a gentleman. I called him a storm disguised as a man. The night before she left, I couldn't sleep. I went downstairs barefoot, guided by the small pool of light spilling from the kitchen. She was there, sitting on a stool, holding a photograph, one I'd never seen before. It was a picture of her son, maybe 5 or 6, missing a front tooth, smiling like the world had never hurt him. She didn't see me at first. Her shoulders were shaking. When she finally noticed me, she wiped her face fast and smiled. "You should be in bed, sweetheart," she said, her voice trembling between sadness and tenderness. I asked if she was crying. She laughed, a small, tired laugh. No, she said, just tired. But even as a child, I knew what a lie sounded like. She told me she was leaving the next day. "Your father says the house needs someone more professional," she said, choosing her words like someone walking through broken glass. I remember the way my chest tightened. "Because of the coffee?" I asked. She shook her head. "Because of the silence," she whispered. I didn't understand it then, but I do now. She wasn't talking about the quiet of the house. She meant the silence we all carried, the one that protected my father, that made him untouchable. When she stood up, she kissed my forehead. "You're a good boy," she said softly. "Don't let them teach you to forget that." The next morning, she was gone. No goodbye, no note. Her room was stripped clean, bed made, drawers empty, no trace of her perfume left in the air. My father was at the table again, reading the newspaper, as if nothing had changed. I asked where she went. He didn't look up. "She wasn't the right fit," he said. "We'll hire someone better." Better. That word stayed with me for years. Better meant quieter. Better meant colder. Better meant less human. As time passed, her absence became just another part of the architecture. Like the paintings on the wall, beautiful, but untouchable. I never saw her again, but sometimes I'd dream of her voice humming from another room, faint and fading. I started watching my father more closely after that. Not because I admired him, but because I needed to understand how someone could control a room with nothing but a glance. He was a master of restraint. Every gesture was calculated, every word chosen for maximum effect. He believed that emotions were for the weak, that power belonged to those who could bury their feelings deep enough to forget they ever existed. Once, at dinner, I asked him why he never said thank you to the staff. He put down his fork and stared at me, not angry, just curious. "You don't thank the hands that serve you," he said. "You thank the order that keeps them there." That night, I lay in bed thinking about that sentence. I didn't know what order meant to him, but I knew it didn't include kindness. Years later, when I was old enough to join him at formal dinners, I saw the same thing play out over and over again. The way people bent their backs a little lower when he entered the room, the way his compliments felt like currency. He never had to demand respect. He created a world where respect was the only way to survive. But I also noticed something else, a loneliness in his eyes when no one was watching, a kind of exhaustion that even wealth couldn't mark. It was the loneliness of a man who'd built an empire out of fear and couldn't remember how to live without it. Sometimes I wonder if he knew what he did to her that morning, if he remembered the coffee stain, the trembling hands, the boy at the table learning what silence costs. I doubt it. For men like him, cruelty isn't an act, it's a habit. That's the strange thing about growing up rich. You see beauty everywhere, but love nowhere. Everything is polished, but nothing is pure. Every smile hides a transaction. And yet, I can't lie, Part of me wanted to be him, because when you grow up in the shadow of power, it's hard not to mistake fear for respect. It takes years to unlearn that. Sometimes, when I walk into boardrooms now, rooms filled with people dressed like my father, speaking in the same clipped tones, I still hear her voice in the back of my mind. Don't let them teach you to forget. I never did, but remembering doesn't make it easy. It just makes the silence louder. Time has a way of smoothing over the sharp edges of memory, but it never really dulls them. You just learn to walk carefully around what still cuts. Years passed, and the house stayed the same. Immaculate, enormous, and utterly cold. It's strange how wealth preserves everything, except warmth. My father and I spoke less as I grew older, not because we fought, but because conversation felt unnecessary. He believed silence was discipline, and I believed speaking to him was like shouting into a mirror. We lived under the same roof, but in different worlds. His made of control, mine made of questions I didn't dare ask. I went off to college when I was 17. He didn't hug me goodbye. He just handed me a watch, gold, heavy, and said, "Be on time." That was his version of affection. Mechanical, efficient, something you could measure. For a while, I tried to forget the house, the ritual, the woman with trembling hands. I tried to live like other people, to laugh too loud, to make mistakes, to feel human. But the lessons of my upbringing clung to me like a second skin. Every time someone raised their voice, I flinched. Every time I saw a server drop a glass, I felt that same sting of guilt, as if my father's shadow had followed me there. Then one night, during winter break, I came home. The house felt smaller, though I knew it wasn't. My mother's perfume lingered in the hallway, faint and floral, like a ghost trying to apologize for staying. My father was sitting in his study, the same leather chair, the same glass of whiskey, half empty beside him. The air smelled of cedar and old ambition. He was on the phone, talking to someone about investments, mergers, profit, the vocabulary of a man who believed money could fix anything. I stood there, waiting for him to finish. He didn't notice me. Or maybe he did, and chose not to. When he finally hung up, he looked at me and smiled, a small, polite curve of the lips. "You look older," he said. I told him I felt older. He poured me a drink, even though I wasn't of age. "You'll need it," he said. I laughed, but he didn't. We sat in silence for a while, staring at the city lights bleeding through the window. They looked like 1,000 tiny fires, each one flickering with a story of its own. I don't know what made me bring her up. Maybe it was the whiskey loosening my restraint, or maybe it was the way the house still felt haunted by things we never said. I asked him if he remembered the nanny, the one from when I was a kid, the one who left after the incident. He frowned, trying to recall. "The woman with the bracelets?" he asked. "Yes." He nodded slowly, as if the memory were a business deal he'd already filed away. "What about her? Do you remember what happened? The coffee?" He sipped his drink. "Barely." "Why?" "Because that morning changed everything," I said. "For me." He stared at me for a long time. "You're being dramatic," he said finally. "People like her come and go. It's the way of things." "People like her," I repeated. "You mean human beings?" He sighed, impatient. "You'll understand when you have responsibilities, when you realize how much you have to lose." That was his excuse for everything, the invisible weight of responsibility, as if cruelty were just a side effect of success. I wanted to shout at him, to tell him how wrong he was, but I didn't. I couldn't, because deep down, I recognized something terrifying. Part of me did understand. I had spent years trying to be like him, composed, logical, untouchable. I'd inherited his habits, his tone, his way of looking through people instead of at them. That realization hit harder than any punishment he could have given me. I left his study without another word. As I walked down the hall, I heard the clock ticking again, that same measured rhythm from my childhood, marking time like a sentence being served. That night, I dreamed of her, not as she was, but as I remembered her, standing in the kitchen, sunlight in her hair, humming that tune I never learned the name of. In the dream, she looked at me and said, "You had a choice." When I woke up, my chest hurt. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was inheritance. I spent the next morning walking through the house. Every room felt smaller, like the walls had grown tired of pretending to be grand. The dining room was exactly the same. Same table, same chairs, same cold perfection. But when I looked at the spot where she'd spilled the coffee, I swore I could still see it. Not the stain itself, but the memory of it. I touched the table, and for the first time, I felt angry. Not just at him, but at myself, for the silence, for the complicity, for the way I had learned to watch suffering and call it order. That was the moment I understood what the real inheritance was. Not the money, not the name, It was the silence, passed down like an heirloom, polished by generations until it looked respectable. My father taught me how to hide behind calmness, how to disguise control as care, and I had believed it. I had built my life around it. Until that morning, standing in that room, I realized that silence doesn't protect you. It poisons you slowly until you mistake numbness for peace. When I left the house again that day, I didn't take anything with me. Not the watch, not the car, not the expectations, just the echo of her voice. The only truth that had ever lived inside those walls. It's strange how the past waits for you. You think you've left it behind, traded it for adulthood, for control, for the right to decide who you are. And then one small thing pulls you back, like a thread unraveling from a suit that once fit perfectly. For me, that thread appeared years later. I was 32, standing in an elevator made of glass, watching the city crawl beneath my feet. I was dressed like my father, same tailored jacket, same polished shoes, same practiced calm. People greeted me with the same tone they used with him, respectful, cautious, a little afraid. And that's when I realized I had become the thing I swore I'd never be, a reflection of the man who taught me that silence was safer than kindness. That night, I attended a charity dinner, the kind of event where people applaud themselves for caring, then go home untouched. The chandeliers sparkled, the wine was aged, and the conversations were about everything except truth. I smiled when expected, laughed when required, and felt nothing at all. Then, halfway through the evening, one of the waitresses tripped near my table. A glass shattered, red wine splattering across the floor like blood in a painting. The room froze. She bent down quickly, whispering apologies, her hands shaking. And suddenly, I was 8 years old again, sitting at that long table, watching a hand tremble over a coffee cup. My chest tightened. Every sound faded. The music, the chatter, the clinking of silverware. I could only hear my father's voice in my head. Carelessness is a form of disrespect. I stood up before I even knew why. The people around me stared, confused. The woman was trying to clean up the mess, panicking, whispering that she'd pay for the glass. I knelt beside her. "Hey," I said softly, "it's fine. It's just a glass." She looked at me, eyes wide, still waiting for punishment. That was the moment I understood how deep the fear of power runs, how long it lingers even when the danger has passed. Someone nearby murmured something about how gracious I was. I hated that. Graciousness should never be rare enough to be praised. After she left, I excused myself and stepped outside. The air was cold, the kind of cold that scrapes honesty out of you. I looked at the city, all those windows glowing like small universes, and I wondered how many stories were being buried behind glass that night. I thought about my father. He had died 2 years earlier. No great tragedy, no poetic ending, just a quiet departure in his sleep. The newspapers called him a visionary. The funeral was elegant, expensive, hollow. People spoke of his discipline, his intellect, his achievements. No one spoke of the silences he left behind. At the reading of the will, I sat alone. The lawyer talked about assets, properties, accounts. My mother cried quietly, though I'm not sure for whom. When it was my turn, I received exactly what I expected. The company shares, the estate, and that same gold watch he'd given me when I was 17. I didn't take any of it. I told them to sell everything and donate it anonymously. The lawyer looked at me like I was insane. Maybe I was, or maybe I just didn't want to keep holding on to someone else's ghosts. That night, I went to the old house one last time. It was empty, waiting to be sold. I walked through each room, touching the walls, the doorknobs, the marble table still there in the dining room. The stain was gone, of course. The table had been replaced years ago, but in my mind, I could still see it. The faint outline of that single drop of coffee that had changed everything. I sat down at the head of the table, his chair. The leather had softened over time, but the feeling of it was the same. I tried to imagine what it felt like to live without compassion, to believe control was love. I couldn't. I didn't want to. I whispered into the empty room, "You were wrong." It wasn't anger. It was something quieter, heavier, a kind of mourning for a man who never learned how to be human. I don't know how long I sat there. The city lights bled through the curtain, and for the first time, the house didn't feel enormous. It felt small, just a box full of echoes, of words that were never said, and feelings that were never allowed. Before I left, I went to her old room. The door creaked the same way it was empty, stripped bare, but I could almost hear her humming. I knelt on the floor and whispered a thank you into the dark, not because she'd ever hear it, but because I needed to. I walked out of that house and never returned. In the years since, people have asked me why I tell these stories, why I reopen wounds that could have stayed buried under golden glass. I tell them it's because silence is inherited, and someone has to break it before it becomes eternal. I live simply now. No staff, no mansion, just a small apartment overlooking the city, where I can watch the lights without feeling owned by them. Sometimes, late at night, I pour myself a drink, sit by the window and think about it. I wonder if she ever forgave me for sitting there that morning, saying nothing while my father took her dignity. I like to imagine she found peace somewhere far away, maybe in a small house filled with noise and laughter, where mistakes aren't punished, just forgiven. I still wear the watch though, not as a tribute to him, but as a reminder of what not to become. Every tick feels like a question. What will you do with the time he wasted? Some nights, I think I know the answer. Other nights, I just listen to the silence and remember how it used to sound when I was too young to understand it. People think inheritance is measured in money. It's not. It's measured in the weight of the things we carry when no one is watching. I thought I'd inherited his empire. I was wrong. I inherited his loneliness. If this story made you think, subscribe. Not for me, but for every son who grew up in silence.